Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Today, I have Kris Camacho on the show. Kris runs Science with a Twist, a podcast run by Fortune 500 and industry-leading scientific corporation, Thermo Fisher Scientific. Running a podcast for a company that has compliance, science research, and frankly, just the red tape of a Fortune 500 company is tough in and of itself. Disclaimer here, the things that I'm talking about that are tough come from me working with Kris, not from Kris really complaining about them to me. But aside from that, Kris faces other challenges in producing her podcast. For each episode, Kris has a different host in a different sector of science research. She has to teach a new host how to host the show, how to bring it in and take it out, how to ask questions appropriately. And lots of times these hosts are researchers or scientists, not people who are used to recorded-based content creation. So today, we're going to cover how Kris is able to pull off a podcast consistently with a lot of hurdles in her way that could easily trip her up. Kris, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And so before jumping into how you are teaching hosts each time what they need to do and how they need to do it, I want to start with the topics that you have to tackle. In addition to having to educate these scientists on how to host, you also need to digest this scientific information and create episode topics based on things like, I was looking at your most recent episodes, Behind the Moon Arc, how a team of artists embrace science to send a time capsule to the moon, or how Jewish Holocaust victims were discovered at a death camp with DNA analysis. So what goes into your process of developing such a wide variety of topics in such a complex space?
Yeah, Thermo Fisher it touches a lot of different things. And we have, aside from being a Fortune 500 company, we also have like 140,000 employees. So it's a very broad space and we touch a lot of different things, which is really cool. I feel like I learn new things all the time about what Thermo Fisher is working on or things that we're impacting that you would notice in your day-to-day life. So I think the biggest challenge is really kind of mining through all of the stuff that we touch and finding what's going to actually be not just a good story, but something that we can tell in the right way and say it in a way that anybody can understand. So I'm not a scientist. I am a marketer and communicator by background. Every time we're picking through episodes, I have to ask myself, do I understand this? And that's kind of my baseline at first is if I can understand it, I think we're good. But that's kind of the hardest part is just combing through all of the incredible things that we're touching on a daily basis and finding those stories that are going to resonate with the audience. We really like to say our audience is science enthusiasts, so they're not actual scientists either. That's why I'm kind of the baseline. We want to bring this content to the masses and share this great research and science breakthroughs with everyone.
Yeah, that probably saves you a little bit, and I'll let you actually give the background on the show, but at least the fact that the show isn't necessarily a technical, I don't even know if I'm using the right terminology, but like a technical show based in science research. Why don't you talk a little bit about what Science with a Twist is and who it helps?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, science enthusiasts is who we're trying to reach. I mean, we're trying to show how science impacts our daily lives. So anything from cleaning drinking water through the fight against COVID. I think we've done episodes on both of those things. And also just anything that would impact your day-to-day life. I think the latest episode we recorded was really interesting. It was around like how humans and in the environment and animals all kind of interact in terms of your health and viruses and things like that. So our subject matter is very different across the board. It's really challenging to find the things that fit, but I think the goal really is to help lifelong learners learn new applications of science that they may not have thought about previously. So it's pretty cool. I love working on this podcast because I feel like I learn a whole lot. And it's really just interesting to sit in on these discussions, even outside of the recording, the discussions we have leading up to it. I just feel like the people that I interact with daily are so incredible, and they just have all this knowledge to share, and they're really bursting at the seams. I find that they really want to get their research out. I actually had a guest recently who said, scientific research loses value when you can't bring it to the masses because most of the time they're finding these breakthroughs that benefit society. But, if the people that it's helping don't know about it, then what good does it do? So that kind of gave me a new perspective on things and just made it even cooler, I think, to give people a platform to speak, but also be able to give them a platform where they can share it with people and have it actually understood by people, not just the people in the scientific community.
And I want to go into your process a little bit. It's no secret that when you're working in a Fortune 500 company or just a large organization, that it can be tough to get ideas pushed through. So, how far in advance of recording do you have to develop your topics, and how do you get them pushed forward?
It kind of differs based on the topic. Some topics are like other things have been done with them in the past. So some of that red tape is already cut through. So I would say the quickest we could push an episode through is about a month. The longest I've seen has been, I mean, we've been working on one episode since the spring, I think. It still hasn't even been recorded yet. So it just kind of depends on the subject matter, and also it depends on the guest. Sometimes we have external people participate on the podcast, and they have their own set of red tape to go through on their end. If it's a client and their company needs to run things through their legal teams or whatever the case may be, sometimes we have two sets of red tape to process. So definitely differs per subject matter and per episode, but yeah, it's definitely not a quick process on our end.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, one of the things that can be tough with a podcast, and I'm actually curious maybe how you've evolved your content creation and idea creation around timeliness. When things do take a long time to go out, and I recently had someone on this show, and he works in the financial sector where things change on a dime, right? No pun intended, but like it could, be completely different tomorrow or in 10 minutes than it is from now. And you still have to go through your process of creating your episode. So how are you balancing? Well, let me take a step back. Maybe you can tell the story from a high level on how you recorded some content and, it may not have been timely to come out. And then how has that impacted you moving forward with how you are trying to make sure that if things do get held up, that when the content comes out, it'll still be relevant?
Yeah, it's a tough challenge for that. One of the things that we try and do is like look at the calendar up front and say, okay, is there any content that will tie into specific things? So, for example, we wanted to do some stuff in the fall around cancer research. And so there's some different, cancer months in the fall that we wanted to kind of tie some content into. So that's kind of one way because we're like, we know this is coming. We know we want to do an episode around it. We can kind of start the ball rolling early to make sure that when it comes out, it's kind of timely. Sometimes it's coincidence. The one we filmed around the Holocaust happened to be released on Holocaust Remembrance Day, which made it extra timely. And then we also just try to find like stuff that's gonna resonate all the time. I know when we first started working on the podcast, I mean, you remember this, we had all these COVID related topics that people wanted to talk about, and it was great to get some content from folks, but COVID was kind of on the decline in terms of how it was being talked about publicly. So I remember we had some conversations saying, like, does it make sense to split up these COVID episodes and kind of break up the COVID chat? Or do we kind of just release them all now? Because it seems like this is kind of declining in terms of the amount that it was being discussed. So we kind of pushed some episodes out all together at the beginning around COVID just to make sure that we were kind of talking about it while it was still being discussed regularly. But then we also have like I have an episode that we recorded that we never even got to really release because some stuff in the market changed and it wasn't really relevant anymore. So I was sad to see that episode not get released,
Yeah,
but
with the amount of work you put in, for sure.
yeah, but it happens and we just kind of have to adapt and adjust as we go. And ideally we would have enough content banked up ahead of time that we could just swap it out with a different one. But with sometimes with the lead times and things that we are facing, it's not really possible to do that. So it is what
Yeah.
it is, but it just happens. It's good. It's good. I like the challenge of it. I don't want it to be too easy.
Yeah, for sure. And, I think that's something that we all have to deal with, is balancing how far out ahead you get, but then at the same time, is the content that I'm putting out evergreen versus timely? And if it is timely, is it going to go out at the right time? Or in that situation, we were looking at those episodes early on, and when we were setting out to do all of those COVID heavy episodes, because for the audience, if you don't know, Thermo Fisher Scientific had a big hand in the creation, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Kris, in the creation of the vaccines and things like that. So they had a lot of brilliant people on staff. And when we started working together, it was like, it was all anyone in the world was talking about. And then it seemed kind of like after we released like that second episode, that it was like, that was really when everyone got their first major wave of COVID fatigue, and like, I don't want to see or hear COVID in anything, any
Yeah.
content, anything. Can we just pretend like it's not happening at least? Because I'm exhausted.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, we had a hand in a lot of the COVID response, from creating test kits to one of our first episodes that we actually did was around the aerosol sense sampler that could detect particles of COVID in the air in indoor spaces. So that was a really interesting piece. So we had this really cool technology that we could speak on. I'm glad we kind of were able to get those in first, and then kind of be able to diversify after that. But yeah, it was seemed like everybody wanted to talk about it, and then it was just like a wall, and that just kind of stopped. So it was nice that we had other content in the pipeline that we could pull from, and start talking about different things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I wanted to talk about next, was just all of these different hosts and such completely different spaces that work within the organization that you're working with. So you got your topic, and you have your host and guest in place. How do you go about training a new host each time on what's expected from them?
Yeah, we kind of lean to the businesses because they're the ones that are really involved in the science of all of these things. So we lean on the businesses to help us get recommendations for a host, because we want somebody that is versed in that subject matter. Since it differs so drastically, the same person wouldn't be able to have a peer-to-peer conversation with a scientist talking about this, because they're not as involved in what's going on in the day-to-day of that specific business. So that's kind of how we choose them. And then once they're on board, it kind of depends. They differ. It's really person to person. So some hosts really prefer to have more stuff scripted out for them. So we'll have to put together more text around like, "Hello, welcome back to Science with a Twist. My name is Kris Camacho, and this is what I do." Like, we have to kind of write that out for them very specifically. But other hosts are like, "I do better off the cuff, and I just want some talking points. Let me know what you want me to say, and I'll weave it in." We're kind of having to like learn preferences and styles for each host every time. But it's helpful that we have a lot of conversations with them throughout the process. So it's not just I've never worked on a podcast outside of this, so I'm not sure exactly how other processes work, but like we're having lots of touch points leading up to the recording to make sure that we're making our hosts feel comfortable, preparing them to do what we need them to do, and really learning their preference. And a lot of times I have hosts that want to like build a rapport with the guest, because sometimes they haven't always met. So we try and get them to be in front of each other as well, just so that they have some rapport and can feel natural speaking to one another. So there's a lot that goes into just making people feel ready to go. And we go back and forth on iterations of scripts. We let them take their own spin on it, and add in words and things that make them feel comfortable. So it's really just a back and forth and a constant communication to try and make sure everybody feels up to speed.
Yeah, and I'm sure with just the amount of different steps you have to take to execute an episode, you really have to pick your battles on where, if somebody wants to say something one way, you're like, is this really where I
Yeah.
want to?
Yeah, it's funny what people prefer. Like they're so drastically different. And like you said earlier, not all of our hosts are used to speaking publicly or in a recorded setting. Even our guests, like they're a lot of times, very involved in the science behind things, which makes them incredibly intelligent people with a knowledge of or a wealth of knowledge to share. But they have to kind of get used to this concept of recording. And I think it takes a lot of pressure off when we tell them, this isn't live. You can re-record things if you stumble over your words. If you want to repeat something, we can do that. That takes a lot of pressure off of them. But we're kind of getting these people that are usually behind the curtain and bringing them to the forefront. And that sometimes can be a bit of a, I don't want to say challenge, but it's definitely something that we have to be mindful of and think about every time we're putting an episode together.
Yeah, and the next thing that I wanted to ask you about was the fact that you're talking to your host and guests are talking about, the complex world of science and research. And, just from having done the episode with my sister recently, who's a historian, and actually my brother is a scientist. He's a marine biologist. I know that folks who deal with research and science are very concerned with what they're going to say. They don't want to say the wrong thing about research that they've done. So what goes into your scripting process to ensure that people are comfortable talking about their area of expertise, openly and without looking like they're reading a research paper word for word?
Yeah, it's hard. I have to sometimes tell them, like, when they think they've dumbed it down enough, I have to get them to do it again. It's they want to talk about it very technically because that's what's natural to them. And I don't love that word dumbed it down because it's still like very intelligently spoken about. It's just that it has to be digestible for a layman's audience. So we take kind of like a first round of a script that we will start, and we don't really script out for our guests as much as we would for a host. We want them to be able to feel like they can talk freely about things, but we'll give them talking points, and we really just have to drive home, like, explain this how you explained it to us when we had our prep call. Like, that description made sense to us, so we need you to explain it on the podcast the same way, and some are better than others at that. Sometimes that's more natural for people, but it's really just like taking it multiple rounds of a script and saying, okay, this is what the story we want to tell. How do we make this digestible for, me? How can I make myself understand this? And sometimes it's just like minimal things like, how do we take this jargony word and make it so it and give an explanation, like what value does this thing add? And then they can kind of talk you through it and say, what it actually means. But it's definitely a process. But I would say it's different iterations of the script, and we share it with, we like to start at the most technical and then work our way down to more digestible as we go. So it's a it's a process. I think there's a lot of back and forth in our process, just with all the communication that we have to deal with to get hosts on board and build the rapport that they want and all of that stuff. But then we're also doing that with every round of the scripts just to make sure that we're up to speed. But then once we do that, the other challenge is making sure we didn't take it and make it too simplified, because
Mhm.
it still has to be, you know, accurate in the way that we explain it. So it's really interesting to see that process. And I don't know. I'd be curious how other podcasts do their process, because this is really all I know at this point. I kind of adopted this podcast as it was already a thing and picked it up for a season two. So I don't
Yeah.
know anything different, but it's definitely an interesting process with a lot of back and forth.
Yeah, for sure. And, I think that's why I wanted to have you on is that I see a lot of different things from podcasts. You see podcasts where two people will just say, hey, we're just here for a conversation. And sometimes I personally feel like that may not be enough for an audience. And then the approach that I take, you came on here today and you're like, I'm not sure if I'm 100% prepared for this because I don't really share my questions in advance, but I do really try to tackle problems, which, in this situation, in this episode, and I try to have a conflict or a problem with every episode so that someone who's listening could say, yeah, I face that problem too. And here's, I'm listening to different solutions. And then I think the thing that's fascinating about your show is just the levels of depth and complexity that go into each episode. So I think generally, there's a lot of different ways. It's a show. So, and yours is much more research based. Mine is a little bit more topical based. You have shows out there that are comedy based. So, it really depends. And something I did want to ask you about as well is just the topics themselves. I would be so curious to hear like what the process is for you going out and finding these topics. Is there like a library of Thermo Fisher Scientific fascinating topics like the moon, the moon arc and sending a time capsule to the moon, or, what goes into your process of actually finding these topics in such different mediums?
Yeah, I would say that most marketers, communicators that are mining for content can probably relate that that's a challenge in and of itself. And then with a company this large, it's also that is an added layer of things to come through. Fun fact, we are actually working on something similar to what you just talked about, this library thing. We are working on putting that together because I think it would make everyone's lives easier for the communicators and marketers across the organization. But it's really a lot of just asking people. I mean, I join a monthly call with all of the communicators for the company, and I'm like begging for like shameless plug, guys, send me podcast topics. And they just send me, what they have got, because it's just so hard to know what's going on in every business when we have such a large organization that touches so many different things. And so I just ask people regularly if they have content in mind. We have like internal newsletters and stuff that go out regularly, and I'll comb through that and see if there's anything interesting. We have an agency partner that helps us with some PR stuff that not only works with us at the corporate level, but also works with a lot of the different businesses. So they have a good line of sight into a lot of different things that are coming. So we tap into them sometimes. I mean, it really just differs. I talk regularly to different businesses just to talk and say, what's cool going on in your world? What do you want to share? Even if it's just, so I don't just own the podcast, I also do some other digital communications efforts. So sometimes I just talk to people and ask what they have going on, and then they tell me about cool things that they want a social post out of, and I'm like, wait, that would actually be a really cool podcast topic. So it's really just a matter of talking to people and combing through our internal communications stuff and just trying to get a line of sight into as much as we possibly can, because we're a lean team working on the podcast. It's not like we have a large amount of people that can pull stories in that they know about. So we're, with only two of us, we kind of have to do a lot of good digging to find the right stuff. But we get a lot of good stories. It's just mining through those too that are, how can we tell this on the podcast where people will understand it? It's a little bit of digging, but it's kind of fun.
Yeah, little did you know that you're actually doing your own research. It's just research on what is Thermo Fisher Scientific doing.
Yeah, it's so cool. It's so cool to like find all these things that you uncover, even if they don't become podcast episodes. I'm like, okay, I didn't know we touched this. Like, I remember we were talking to the team about the Holocaust episode. They pitched like 3 different stories to us that were all using that same human identification technology. And we ultimately went with this story about discovering these Holocaust victims in a Polish death camp from World War II. But that same technology was used to like catch serial killers and like just really interesting stuff that you just wouldn't even know that one company could touch that many different things. So that part of it is really fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I imagine that each episode for you is pretty exciting.
It is. And I join all the recordings, and I'm sure some people that are in my shoes would just join and be like, you guys got this. But I'm like invested the whole time. I'm like, oh gosh, what else are you going to say about this? So it's really, I like to think that I am the audience that we outlined for Science with a Twist. Like, I'm a science enthusiast, a lifelong learner. I want to know more about what science is touching in my daily life. So it makes it fun to be a part of the podcast and the development process of it.
And there you go. Nobody can be offended if you say you're dumbing down the content, because you're also saying that it's for you. So
It's for me.
nobody be offended out there.
Yes.
A question I had on the content itself. So your episodes are typically shorter, and for those listening, I'm using finger quotes because shorter can mean anything. I do 7-minute episodes at times, but I think that people, when it comes to interview-based episodes, usually think they're going to be in like the 30 to 45, maybe 60-minute time frame for a business podcast, and yours are typically around 20 minutes in length. Is there any rationale around the length of episode?
Yes, I'm a digital marketer by background. I am very familiar with the digital attention spans. They're just getting shorter and shorter. So I think we ultimately were like, can we give this information to people in like a bite-sized clip, right? Like we're not trying to I watched the episode with your sister and she said this and it resonated with me as well. We're not trying to like lecture people or like give them all of the information. It's really to like unlock something where, oh, I want to learn more about this. So that's kind of our rationale behind that. And we found like 20 to 25 minutes is really our sweet spot. We feel like we can get in everything we want to say about a topic without really like being overly wordy or preachy or any, we're not trying to talk at you for so long. So I think that that really is a good sweet spot for us is that 20 to 25-minute mark and it works well for us. I think that's people like to participate in an episode that length because we're not requiring so much of their time. A lot of our guests and hosts are really busy, working on scientific stuff. So we like to give them a time frame that's reasonable for them, so we're not pulling them away from their research for too long.
Yeah, for sure. And I just get that question a lot when people ask, how long should my podcast be? And, it has been interesting to hear the different rationales, on these research-based podcasts inevitably are shorter in length, whereas I typically do a 30 to 45-minute episode or so. Yet the research podcasts that I've spoken to are both intentionally shorter in length, but the research itself is probably 100 times, if not 10,000 times more in
Mhm.
depth than the episodes that I'm doing. So I just find that fascinating. It's like we want to give you just kind of the overview of what the takeaways are. And if you want to go and do your own research, oh, don't worry, there's plenty of it.
Yes, we're just scratching the surface with the episodes. There's so much more in depth that you can go, and I mean, I think this is something that we're going to start doing more of, and this was actually something that you and I had talked about when I was coming to you on our meetings. Like I'm struggling to find content, but it's also a way that we can kind of delve deeper into subject matter is doing these like little mini series, right? So we can have one host for 3 different episodes talking about, something in different capacities. So you can get a little deeper as you go down the list of episodes in the series, but it solves a lot of our headaches, across the board. Being able to have one host for 3 episodes it's like I feel like I'm on vacation working on this one because it's like not having to get 3 different people up to speed. But it also gives us a chance to go deeper into some subject matter and talk about things in different use cases and just show people a different side of science in different facets, but all in the same realm. It's kind of a cool new thing that we're going to work on for the fall, and hopefully it'll be a successful endeavor for us.
Yeah, and that was really where my next question was going to go was, when you set out to do this, you, if I remember correctly, have no podcasting experience in your background. And now you're doing things like, okay, we're going to have the same host for 3 episodes and we're going to tackle a topic. So my question was, how have things changed or gotten better for you as you've produced more episodes?
Yeah, before this, my extent of podcast experience was listening to murder podcasts. So this was very new challenge for me. And I definitely never been involved in the production of them. But I think the more I do it, the more I know kind of what makes a good episode, which helps me mine through the abundance of content and stories a little easier because I know what we're looking for, but also just finding little ways to make my life easier here and there, like the mini series idea and having one host for 3 different episodes like that is makes our lives a lot easier. It just helps us get a good chunk of content all up front. And then just the more you do it, it's like anything. It's like the more you do it, the more you learn and you pick up little things that are helpful. And I'm still learning as I go. I mean, I'm not an expert by any means, but I feel like I just learn new things every episode, and we just go from there. We just adapt and adjust. That's Someone told me like my first week at Thermo Fisher, they were like, change is constant here. Like you're always going to have to adapt and adjust. Podcasting is no different, especially at Thermo Fisher. We're having to just adapt and adjust as we go and go with the wind. I mean, we go with how the industry shifts. We go with how, the content changes. We go with what's relevant. There's a lot of ways that we're shifting as we go, but it's same with my knowledge of podcasting and how it gets easier for me is just adapting as we go. We're learning and making it better.
Yeah, I think that's the case for pretty much everyone with podcasting, including myself. I mean, I change I have to change and adapt as I go. The camera that you see me on right now is different than the camera that I've used in the past. And now I have to set up lights and, I have new recording equipment and I've gotten better at asking questions and setting up how I script my shows. And, I'll probably be better at it in 6 months and in a year. And so, I appreciate that. And I think the biggest thing is just being able to stay consistent, being able to adapt and deal with some of these hurdles that could get put in our way. Everyone deals with them. The shows that'll stand out over time are the ones that are able to continue hitting that record button. And I'm happy to hear, you're finding ways to make that a little bit easier for yourself. So with that, I think that's a good spot to end. Since we're coming up on our time, where should people go to learn more about you, Science with a Twist, and Thermo Fisher?
Science with a Twist podcast can be found on anywhere you get your podcasts, on the Thermo Fisher YouTube page, Spotify, Apple. We also have at corporate.thermofisher.com. We have the podcast on there as well. And there's different pages for each episode, so you can read about all of the different things that we've worked on and see some cool teaser clips and such. So there's a lot of good information out there at the corporate website for sure.
All right, Kris, thanks again. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. It was great having you on Recorded Content.
Thanks, Justin.